The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden, in Berlin, Germany, for just another couple of weeks. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, just as we are going to air, some news is coming over the wires that there's been a major loan extended from the United States government to Sri Lanka. And this is part of a major push that the United States is doing to step up its infrastructure diplomacy. Let's take a listen to how the story broke on New Delhi television in India.
The United States of America will provide $553 million in financing for a port terminal in Sri Lanka's capital being developed by businessman Gautam Adani as New Delhi and Washington look to curtail China's influence in South Asia. The funding from International Development Finance Corporation underscores renewed US and Indian efforts to loosen China's sway over Sri Lanka after Colombo borrowed heavily to splurge on Chinese port and highway projects before its economic meltdown last year. The Deepwater West Container Terminal in Colombo is the US government agency's largest infrastructure investment in Asia and amongst its biggest globally.
So we have erased now, Cobus, officially, that the United States is in the infrastructure game. It's talked about doing this for a very, very long time, but it looks like checks are now starting to be written. Africa is one of the major places that the U.S. is focusing its attention on. And for that, I'd like to kind of step back a little bit and really talk about the U.S. infrastructure agenda, which is the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Initiative. This is a companion to what the European Union is doing with the Global Gateway. And one of the major projects that they're looking at is something called the Lobito Corridor in Angola. Let's take a listen now from, again, a little bit of background on this, because I think it'll set up our conversation today on the Belt and Road quite nicely, from U.S. Acting Special Coordinator in the State Department, Helena Matza.
The partnership, which we call PGI, so we don't have to keep saying Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment every time we raise it, was created at the G7 in 2022 between all G7 partner countries in an attempt to find a way that we can materially support closing the infrastructure gap in emerging economies around the world. We designed the initiative with our partners to help deploy $600 billion of infrastructure investment support over the course of 5 years. We have, as the US government, President Biden, committed to make sure that we deploy and leverage $200 billion of those $600 billion. Since that launch, we've been very hard at work. And at the G7 this past spring in Hiroshima, he introduced the concept that we've been working on very closely about trying to ensure that we're helping support infrastructure development in what he calls an economic corridor approach. And he announced our first project, our first corridor, which was a strong focus on expanding the Trans-Africa connection through an early investment in the Lobito corridor. And so at that summit, he announced our first kind of tranche of investments, which were mostly focused in Angola, but working on the connectivity between Angola, DRC, and Zambia. So we were delighted not only to be able to announce the deployment of almost $1 billion of support for new solar development, which we know is just in its final days of getting sorted out before construction begins, but also announcements around our support and intent to provide loan assistance for the rail refurbishment from the port of Lobito all the way to the DRC border and ultimately to Kolwezi in DRC.
Now, Cobus, there is a long way to go between the rhetoric coming out of the State Department, like we just heard, and an actual railway and an economic corridor and all the green initiatives that they're talking about. But you and I have been quite critical of the U.S. on these issues for a number of years now. But I have to say, I think this is a little bit of a different mood that we're in right now. Money is starting to actually flow. Whether, again, they complete the projects remains to be seen, but there's a lot more momentum that they've had, certainly in the past 4 or 5 years.
It does certainly look like it. It'll be very interesting to see how the project is structured, like what the fine print is, like what is actually being planned and what the timelines are. But it's very interesting to see that the US is actually moving forward on this. And, I think what will be probably a challenge, is to see whether it's possible for African countries and other countries to use it as a form of adding value rather than just aiding extraction, particularly in Africa, specifically around critical minerals. But, I think anything beyond extraction is a lot more challenging, but it'll be interesting to see whether they can get there.
And it really speaks to the importance that African countries are going to have in terms of articulating what they want from the United States and from China, and having a more sophisticated understanding of the capabilities of these two countries to deploy capital now in these new eras. A lot of what we're hearing about the U.S. initiatives are being framed as some kind of competition with the Belt and Road Initiative from the Chinese. I think that's quite premature in many respects, simply because the scale of what the United States and the Europeans are doing is a fraction of what the Chinese are doing. And we got a sneak peek into the real massive breadth of the Belt and Road with a new report that came out from AidData at William and Mary College. It's a report called Belt and Road Reboot, Beijing's Bid to De-risk its Global Infrastructure Initiative. Let me just kind of lay it out here. It's going to blow you away when I tell you these numbers about the scale of what they looked at. They built a data set that captures 20,985 projects across 165 low and middle income countries that are supported by loans and grants from official sector institutions in China worth, and here we go, $1.34 trillion. And again, that's why when we talk about this competition between the United States and China, it's not really a competition. When in the United States context, we're talking about low hundreds of millions, maybe $500 million, as we saw in Sri Lanka. And here, this data set covers $1.34 trillion. It tracks projects over 22 years from 2000 to 2021 and provides details on the timing of project implementations over a 24-year period from 2000 all the way up to this year. 100 people worked on this initiative at AidData. It's an amazing team that they've got over there. I was privileged enough to spend some time at William & Mary this past summer to meet the team. Got a little bit of a sneak peek at this project. It is much bigger than I could have ever imagined. And we are thrilled to have one of the lead researchers on this initiative, Ammar Malik, who is a senior research scientist at AidData, joining us from Virginia. A very good morning to you. Congratulations on this enormous project that you guys just published.
Good morning. Thank you very much. We're delighted to have published this and very happy to talk to you this morning.
We're going to keep our conversation at a pretty high level, only because the breadth and depth of this report would actually risk us from getting into the weeds and just nerding out too much and people getting really bored. So we're going to have other members of the research team to come back and do deep dives on some of the specifics of it. I think for the purposes of the next 30, 40 minutes, just give us the kind of the big picture of what you and the team found. You started your report saying that this is a myth-busting report that provides evidence about the changing nature, scale, and scope of China's overseas development program. You also wanted to put to rest the idea that China is no longer in the lending game and that the BRI in some ways is dead. That is not true. Give us the overview of the changing nature, scale, and scope of China's overseas development programs that you found.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric. Yes, absolutely. I think that's where I would like to start. The first question that we answered in this report was whether China is still the single largest source of development finance in the world, as it was during the BRI 1.0 era, or the early years of the BRI. And we have found and documented, as you noted, that on average, now China's development finance program is hovering at around $80 billion a year. It is definitely still the largest provider of development finance in the world. However, the composition of this development financing has shifted. Infrastructure is being ramped down and rescue lending is being ramped up. So the peak that we saw during BRI years, according to our data set, was in 2016 with infrastructure of about $86 billion. but it came down all the way to around 21 billion in 2020 during the height of the COVID, and it has gone up slightly in the year 2021, which is the last commitment year that we have captured the data. On the flip side, we have documented $276 billion worth of rescue lending. Remember, we're talking about $1.3 trillion worth of projects in our data set, about 825 billion in infrastructure total, and 276 or so in balance of payments or rescue lending. And that percentage has been growing in the BRI 2.0 era. And I think that is something that will perhaps take a lot of people by surprise.
Just before we go on, can you just define what rescue lending is? Because that's not a clear concept, I think, for a lot of people.
Absolutely. So these are loans that are given out to developing countries, or mostly in this case, countries who have large BRI debt exposure. These are intended to be for shoring up the foreign exchange reserves, such as through debt swaps to central banks in the form of RMB loans. They could also take the form of deposits or budget support, like Pakistan has received in the last 5 or 6 years. That country alone has received $25 to $28 billion in these sorts of loans, where ICBC, Bank of China, or some of the policy banks would deposit 500 billion or more for a short period of time at a pretty high interest rate. And then often, as we hear in the news, these loans are rolled over for years to come. So the idea is to keep these countries afloat and enable them the liquidity that they need to stay current with their repayment obligations externally and keep them afloat.
So what is in it for China to extend all of this rescue lending? And what is the kind of implications for the global debt, and particularly in the global south, the kind of like debt picture we're looking at?
Cobus, as you know, China went on a lending spree as the Belt and Road was announced. We have documented the existence of around 5,000 loans of 1.3 trillion, 825 billion of which was infrastructure. Now the situation is such that 80% of China's loan portfolio is in financially distressed countries. This means also that these countries are having trouble repaying the loans that they had taken on in BRI 1.0 years. Another statistic to keep in mind is that 55% of loan payments are now due for repayments. And our projections are that by 2030, 75% of the portfolio will be due for repayments. And remember, this is happening at a time when interest rates are incredibly high. Benchmark interest rates, LIBOR and SHIBOR, which are used in these loans, are at record high levels. And this is just an era of high inflation. So it's sort of like a perfect storm for many countries. Now, what the Chinese have done is, by ramping up rescue lending, they are essentially doing themselves a favor and a favor to developing countries to make sure that they remain current with the payments that they owe to them and to other creditors. Just another thing to remember is they've also done this through a rise in syndicated loans. In the year 2021, which is the last year when we collect commitment year data, 50% of the portfolio is now through syndicated loans, which means that Chinese banks are no longer going ahead as bilateral providers of foreign development assistance. They're actually teaming up with non-Chinese banks, multilateral institutions, private banks, and others. Actually, 80% of these syndicates include non-Chinese banks or financial institutions. So I think that really is a standout feature of Chinese development finance. And I think we need to reset some of our assumptions about what Belt and Road really is, because this is a very different Belt and Road from what we have believed over the last few years.
I'd like to get into the changes in the Belt and Road, but I just want to stay on this theme that you've talked about in terms of the lending spree that the Chinese went on. Africa was a major beneficiary of that, particularly countries like Kenya and Angola in particular. When we look back now, and your data starts to do that, this is starting to be the first draft of history about the Belt and Road that has a full comprehensive view. And I'm going to ask you a question that you might not be able to answer. Okay, so if you can't answer it, that's fine. But when we look back, was China an irresponsible lender for extending out so many loans, or did China get caught by circumstances beyond its control with the pandemic, the economic crises? Now we have wars, and that then complicated the repayment abilities of these developing countries. But if we were back in 2015, 16, when China was really writing the big checks, in hindsight, was that irresponsible?
Eric, that's a big question. Obviously, I think that my immediate reaction is there is a generous explanation and there is a sinister or negative explanation. The generous explanation is that China was announcing a big infrastructure push. They saw huge amounts of demand for the sorts of infrastructure that it funded in Africa and elsewhere. It came to the party in a big way, in an unprecedented way. And as it was going along, it was learning and it was adapting. Part of what we do in this report also, by the way, is document a huge shift in the ways in which China has increased safety on the Belt and Road. What we mean by that is environmental and social safeguards that they have improved quite a bit during the BRI era or the late BRI years. That to me is a more generous explanation of what transpired. They were being demand responsive and they were doing the right thing for these countries and they were responding to what they were being asked to do. On the flip side, you could also say that some of the safeguards that the Chinese were putting in place in the early years were not up to the mark. The due diligence on the financing was not up to the mark. For example, in Zambia, I saw IMF reports as early as 2017 that there should be better due diligence on some of the big infrastructure loans that are being taken on. And it wasn't surprising that a year later, almost all new development financing from China stopped. And ironically, when they finally signed the BRI MOU in 2018, that's when new loans stopped coming in. So I think it could also be seen as serving China's purposes because China was sitting atop a mountain of foreign exchange reserves and they were doling out dollar-denominated loans for good returns that they could not get in US Treasury because remember in the early BRI years, US Treasury bond yields were very, very low. And so these were good bankable projects and they were getting good returns. So they were serving their own purposes. That would be my analysis of it. Of course, we all have debunked the idea of debt trap diplomacy. I don't even know what it means, to be honest. So I wouldn't go as far as that.
Excuse me. We have not all debunked it because Joe Biden still apparently thinks it's a thing.
Yes, absolutely. I heard that and we were all surprised. I think it's time to put that to bed.
So, one of the big overarching themes of the report is that China is future-proofing the BRI. In broad terms, what does that mean? Like, what kind of improvements or kind of guardrails are they putting in?
So if you were to think of all the rescue lending and the syndication that I talked about, we call it firefighting. So on the one hand, they are on a rescue mission trying to make sure that their loans get repaid on time and with interest. So that's short term. But in the long term, I think that could be perhaps the most interesting and policy relevant insight from our analysis, which is that China has dramatically improved and is improving the ESG safeguards, environmental, social, and governance safeguards in its portfolio. So if you go back to the main argument of the US and G7, it is that their infrastructure through PGII is going to be higher quality. China already has advantages of speed and scale, but they were lacking on safeguards. We found, for example, that around 50% of early BRI projects had one or more of these concerns around corruption scandals, labor protests, environmental issues, etc. But what we have now found through original unredacted loan agreements, by the way, we've published a treasure trove of escrow account agreements and loan agreements on our website as part of this data set. 60% of the loan agreements or the portfolio we estimate now has strong ESG safeguards. And here's the most important thing, Eric and Cobus. The implementation speed or the time it takes China to deliver projects is still the same. We do not find any difference in the amount of time it takes China to deliver project with high ESG safeguards. And it is just incredible that they are still averaging around 3 years according to our data set. Whereas if you look at grade A World Bank projects, on average, last time I checked, they take over 7 years to take projects to commencement. This is just going to commencement, not even construction. That's right. So I think that this is a real wake-up call for the G7 in the US because China is really completing the square and saying we can now do things in scale, speed, but also with higher quality safety that the G7 and the US are claiming are going to be their differentiators. I just don't see that to be big.
That is a huge advantage. I mean, just a huge advantage. I always use the example of here in my fair city, in Ho Chi Minh City, the Japanese started building the subway back in 2012. We are 2023 and we still don't have a subway. So it's not easy to build this kind of infrastructure. So the fact that they're doing this in 3 years is absolutely enormous. Cobus, let me just get your take on this from what you're hearing from Ammar. You just recently completed a research project with Boston University, LSE, SIA, and Fudan University about Chinese ESG standards in 3 countries that you looked at. How does what Ammar's saying in terms of their ESG standards align with what you found in this research project that you just recently did?
Yeah, it's a very interesting contrast because I think like our project was a bit more kind of like looking at the past. I think it provided a snapshot of some of the problems that I think China is now pivoting to try and solve, including, like less than robust kind of guidelines from the Chinese authorities. And I think during the kind of scope of the projects that we were looking at, those tightened up considerably. And also, in a lot of ways, a kind of a deferring to local recipient government kind of environmental standards, for example, which frequently then also got the projects kind of caught up in local issues, kind of local, like fights between different implementing authorities within the recipient country, or just kind of, officials taking advantage of loopholes in local regulation. And one of the really interesting things for me, like one of the interesting points for me in the AidData report, and Ammar, I was hoping that you could expand on that a little bit, is that they are now including a lot of Western institutions as part of the kind of monitoring and, and sustainability kind of mapping and so on of the projects. I wonder, Ammar, if you could talk a little bit more about how they are kind of getting around the weaknesses of like that we're encountering before.
Absolutely. Cobus, we have basically created in our report 9 types of contracts. Some that China would go alone without any other partners. So an Exim Bank government concessional loan, for example. And then we compare that to all sorts of other combinations. Sometimes they're going in putting together a syndicate with a Western bank. Sometimes they do a Western bank and a Western multilateral institution and so on. So as I said earlier, 50% of the loan portfolio now is syndicated. And essentially what they're doing is quite smart. I think what China is now doing is they're basically outsourcing the ESG function to the lead arranger in the syndicate. Remember, in banking, the syndicate forms its own entity. There could be 5, 6, or even 14, 15 banks who come together under the wings of a lead arranger. And if that lead arranger happens to be, let's say, the IFC, then all the banks that line up behind it will accept the IFC's environmental and safety standards. So instead of trying to reinvent the wheel and instead of trying to get its own banks and its corporations to learn how to do ESG properly, the Chinese are doing what I would call a shortcut way of doing it, which is to outsource ESG risk management to entities that know how to do it. And I think that is really a big change that we have observed and something to take care of. And again, if I go back to the point I was making about competition, PGII is talking all about public-private partnerships. They're talking about how to get private sector into it. Well, what is a syndicated loan? It is a PPP. It's a public-private partnership. So on that count too, the Chinese are ahead of Washington and they're able to do these projects properly. And if I may add, Cobus, to your findings, we have a text box in our report on the Lahore Orange Line project, which was a 1.6 billion 2% government concessional loan given out to the government of Pakistan. What we found was, according to our coding criteria in the contract, it was very well organized. It had an environmental management plan, environmental action plan, all sorts of de jure requirements. But the reality is that when the bulldozers showed up for earthworks, the local community discovered that the digging was taking place within 50 feet of the Shalimar Gardens, which is a 15th century UNESCO World Heritage Site. And what it turned out to be was a 2-year legal battle between civil society and the government of Punjab, not the Chinese contractors or not Exim Bank, but the government of the Punjab, where the argument was that the approval that was given by the Director General of Archaeology was illegal because there is a law in Pakistan which says you cannot construct within 200 feet. So my point is that even if there are watertight clauses in the contracts, the reality of these places can be quite different, as we all know. So that is a frontier area that we would love to dig more into with other academics around the world.
The title of the report has the word de-risk in it, and that's something I'd like to explore a little bit. And in one of the areas that we see evidence of this de-risking is in the loan collection and the securitization of these loans through collateral. So there is, I think, a data point there that says that 72% of the loans are now collateralized. And that means there's another asset that backs up the loan, and that if the loan fails, they can draw it. Oftentimes it's these escrow accounts. That's up almost more than 3 times since 2000, when it was just 19% had these collateralizations. So a lot of them are in the form of escrow accounts. And maybe walk us through what de-risking means in the context of the Belt and Road and the findings, and how it's changed from 2000 to 2023.
You may remember, Eric, that a couple of years ago, AidData launched a study called How China Lends. And that was really the first time that we were able to document the existence of these cash collateral accounts and escrow accounts. You would also recall that we had Brad Parks come from AidData and come talk to you about the Uganda Entebbe airport example. The new thing that we have uncovered in this report is the fact that we now have access to escrow accounts, escrow account agreements. And so we are now trying to connect the dots to try to understand what's actually happening. And here's my understanding of what's taking place. China is now increasingly finding itself in situations where, well, they are asking countries or recipients to maintain minimum cash balances. Typically, they are 1 to 3 payments, which is usually a 6-month payment. So it's 15, 18 months worth of payments in a cash account. And they are also signing escrow account agreements where they are requiring a second escrow account to be created, which is a revenue escrow account. In the revenue escrow account, the recipient is supposed to deposit some percentage, 50% or some case 100%, as was the case in the Entebbe airport, of their local currency revenues into an escrow account. And there are these automaticity clauses where when China does sweep out or clean out the escrow account in the event of non-payment, the revenue account, which is linked to the escrow account, automatically replenishes that amount to a minimum level. And that is really setting, very strong signals to the borrowers that if you don't repay us on time, that we have these other mechanisms that are in place. And we have, for the first time, I would say, documented the existence of these twin accounts that work in tandem, which is one of the many de-risking strategies that we document in our report, but I can talk about others as well.
Is this a sketchy thing? Is it weird? Is it, a lot of people, they hear these words of the escrow accounts and they think it's something that is nefarious. The way I hear it is that China is investing or loaning money into higher risk areas, and it wants to have some guarantees that it's going to get its money back. And by requiring these escrow accounts, that is an insurance that it's going to get at least partially repaid. The other part of this is that this is, I presume, negotiated on between the borrower and the creditor. So obviously the borrowing country, Uganda in this case, agrees to everything. So is there anything nefarious or weird about these escrow accounts that we should be aware of?
I mean, from a pure private finance perspective, no, escrow accounts are a well-established method. This is not a Chinese invention. I mean, I have an escrow account on my home mortgage here in the United States.
Yeah, I was about to say, if we have a home mortgage in the US, those are quite common.
Absolutely. I think the problem comes with the fact that these loans, as we've talked about previously, have implications for national budgets and the well-being of people and public welfare, and that these details that I'm discussing with you today are never subjected to public scrutiny. I don't think that these are discussed in parliamentary hearings as openly. These loan agreements are never shared publicly, as we saw in the Uganda example until AidData published it. And I think that's the part that makes it different, because these are private sector mechanisms that are being deployed for public infrastructure with implications on public budget. And as we discovered in Sri Lanka and in the case of Zambia, if a country defaults, it brings unbearable misery on millions of people. So that is my worry, that these details are not in the public and they're not being discussed. They're being treated as private affairs between private parties. But in fact, one of the parties, at least here, or maybe even both of the parties, are governments. And I think we need more transparency and more public discourse on the details of these, so that the public, who eventually is responsible for repaying these loans, they should know what's going on.
But just to be clear, that is not a Chinese obligation. That is the obligation of the host government and the borrowing government, right?
Absolutely. I think it is definitely the obligation of countries who take it, the taxpayers who are paying for it. But it is something that is affecting China and will affect China. So I think it might be in China's interest to encourage these governments to be more open and transparent about these dealings so these details don't come back to bite them. But I don't think that that's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, kind of like if there's one narrative that will strengthen the debt trap story, it's this one. So just to be clear, like you mentioned recently, or just kind of like a few seconds ago, the possible kind of sweeping of these escrow accounts in the case of a default. Can you explain a little bit what that means? Like, kind of how, on very basic terms, so that they set up the account, what percentage of the project is roughly should kind of be in that account, and how would that work in the case of default?
Right. So first of all, these accounts are created at the time of signing of the loan. Typically, we find that 1 to 3 payments are put as the minimum requirement for maintaining the balance, which is basically 5 to 10% of the face value of the account. And for illustration, we have noted a number of projects in our report in Chapter 2 where this has taken place. And what I mean by sweeping is that if the borrower is unable to repay or make a payment, or there's a situation where they are in default or will be in default, the bank which controls the escrow account has the right to essentially debit it without any consultation, any process, because the borrower has already relinquished the right to control that account. It's basically belongs to the bank and it is for their use. And that's what I mean by sweeping, that there are cases that we've documented where they have essentially debited the account. And then the problem is, okay, now what happens when the escrow account is down to 0? We've swept what we could sweep. What happens now? And that's where that automaticity clause comes in that I was describing earlier, where the borrower's revenues in local currencies are being moved into a related account, a revenue account, and then they are automatically required to buy dollars and replenish the escrow account, which I was talking about earlier. So that is a method that is being used at the moment, and it might be common to private financing, but certainly is a new finding and one that we haven't seen being discussed in the public before.
You mentioned earlier in our discussion that this report gives us some visibility into the future direction of the Belt and Road. And we've heard a lot lately about the new small is beautiful, small and beautiful, small or beautiful, 小而美. I don't know what the right way to describe it is, but it is smaller and it is more beautiful, more green, more in line with ESG, more in line with host country demands and whatnot. What should people know about the future direction of the BRI based on the findings in your report?
Eric, the one big one that I described earlier is that we cannot use BRI 1.0 era assumptions in this new era. This BRI 2.0 is different. It has better ESG safeguards than ever before. There is greater risk on the debt side of things, and there is much greater syndication. And this is no longer a bilateral affair. We always thought of BRI as being bilateral, money going from China to developing countries. But when we touch a point where half of new commitments are in syndicates, I think it is a fundamentally different project, the Belt and Road. And another thing, as you think of the future, has to do with the third aspect or the third risk that we deal with in our report, in addition to the ESG and the financing, which is soft power, or what we would call reputational risk. And in that, what we find very clearly is that unlike what some people might believe, China invests a lot of time and effort in keeping an eye on the media in developing countries, on public opinion, and on elite opinions about them. So what we find is that in the late BRI years, 2/3 of all Chinese financing is going into countries which we think are competitive, which we define as toss-up or competitive places, which means that they are a risk-averse lender, China. Only 16% of the late BRI era money is going into countries which are in moonshot category for China, which means they are much more closer to the US and are moving closer to the US and the West. And that tells me that there is a nervous system in Beijing and through their diplomatic channels where they're keeping an eye on how things are going on the soft power front and then making adjustments. So in the future, I am seeing more and more trends similar to what I'm seeing in the previous years, which is that when China faces headwinds, they will lay low and not make commitments. Zambia is a great example of that. But when they are benefiting from tailwinds, when the wind is on their back, like you see in Bangladesh, they will double down and do much bigger and better projects. So I think that is a direction that I expect China to follow, because that appears to be their playbook according to the analysis that we've done with this big data.
So, kind of when the report was launched, you were quoted saying, in the long run, it's not clear that the US and its allies have the financial firepower to compete dollar for dollar with Beijing. And considering that we're seeing so much of kind of other initiatives like Global Gateway, PGII, and so on being couched as explicitly in terms of competing with Beijing, can you kind of expand a little bit on that? I think a lot of people listening would be surprised, considering, kind of obviously that the US still is the world's largest economy, that to hear that they're not kind of really able to compete dollar for dollar with China on these kind of initiatives. Like, what was, some of your thinking around that statement?
Cobus, I think the main driver of Belt and Road financing was the mountain of foreign exchange reserves that China has been sitting on, upwards of $3 trillion even now. And Brad Setzer at the Council for Foreign Relations, who's one of the world's experts in international finance, has coined this idea of hidden reserves. And he actually thinks that there is an additional $3 trillion of foreign exchange reserves parked in the Chinese state banking system. So they are sitting on a huge pile of cash. And even if the Chinese economy slows down, I don't think that that's going to directly affect their ability to dole out these loans in the way that we might think it would. As far as the US is concerned, between 2020 and 2021, which remember was the first year of the Biden administration, we saw a 15 times increase in the budget of the US Development Finance Corporation. I think you talked about their activity in Sri Lanka earlier. We noticed that the US was hovering at around $37 to $38 billion in development finance all throughout the BRI years, whereas in 2021, they touched for the first time $60 billion. And they did it mainly by increasing by about $21 billion the DFC's budget, which does not do ODA or aid in a traditional way. It actually does development finance or credit, sort of the way the Chinese do it. The problem I see with this approach, as you mentioned, is one, the West simply doesn't have the sort of liquidity on their balance sheet that they can dole out $80 to $100 billion a year for the next 10 years. I just don't see that happening. Also, another aspect of this that is very important to remember is that when we at AidData do these surveys of elites, remember we run the Listening to Leaders survey. My colleague Sam Custer runs that. There is a very clear pattern that developing country leaders, elites who run ministries, they do not want infrastructure from the US or West. They know that it is not their strength to do big ticket infrastructure rapidly. They want China to provide them that. What they want from the West is soft things, technical assistance, policy advisory, those sorts of things. But the West is moving in the different direction, and the people who they are serving are not looking for things from them of the sort that they're providing. So I think that's a really interesting mix that is playing out, and it would be very interesting to see how this greater development finance initiative from the DFC pans out in the next 3 to 5 years.
It's going to be an interesting test. Very quickly before we go, I just wanted to see if you could maybe take us behind the scenes a little bit. This was a massive project, 21,000 projects that you guys looked at over 20 years. You had 100 researchers. How did you organize this in such a way that you were able to dig through all this data? And I guess the other question that popped in my mind is, where did you get all this information from? I was always under the assumption that the Chinese were pretty secretive about these loan contracts. How does it happen, without revealing any of your sources, how does it happen that a college in the United States and a research institute in the United States is able to tap into such a huge trove of raw material?
Well, I always joke, Eric, that the Chinese can tomorrow put us out of business by disclosing all of this detail, and we would have nothing to do. But I think my job is pretty secure based on what I can tell. You're absolutely right, Eric. This is an absolutely enormous effort. This is definitely a labor of love and takes a lot of effort and persistence and organization over many, many years. I will take you back 10, 11 years. AidData has pioneered the tracking underreported financial flows methodology. In fact, for those of you who want to nerd out about the details, we have a 140-page methodology document in which we detail all of the steps that we take to put this enormous data set together. Remember that this data set is backed by 147,000 sources, all of which are out in the public, which means on average, we have 7 sources per project, and 90% of our projects are backed by at least one official source, which means it could be a loan agreement, it could be a press release from a Chinese institution, it could be an annual report or something like that. We should also add, by the way, just to give you an idea of the scale of this project, there are 3.5 million words or 19 full-length words worth of descriptions on our website that you can go and dig into. And you can do keyword searches. You can do string searches. If, let's say, you're interested in lithium and Chile, you can do that keyword search. I would also add that one team in our AidData is focused entirely on georeferencing this data. So with these projects, we are also releasing a geospatial data set where 9,500 projects have been georeferenced. Most of them accurately or precisely georeferenced, which means we don't tell you which district this power plant is. We actually draw the boundaries of that. And we also have precise calendar day level implementation start and completion dates for 11,000 projects, which means you can calculate delays and all sorts of other things. We have also identified around 800 official sector donors and lenders in China, and about 1,200 or so co-financing institutions. Now, you must be thinking, how do we do this? You're right that in any given year, about 100 people work in the Chinese Development Finance Program at AidData. This is a combination of students at William & Mary, professional staff, postdoctoral fellows, as well as our executive director, Brad Parks, who's really the force behind all of this. As far as the highest value sources are concerned, I think we're getting increasingly better at obtaining these documents through direct correspondence with officials in developing countries, through direct correspondence with people who are involved in these projects. We also use aid management platforms in developing countries. And much of this information, believe it or not, is available on the internet. We have no secret sauce of doing this. It just takes persistence and hard work. And over many years, you get better and better at doing these things and getting access to these documents. And that really is the massive improvement that we've made recently, which is lower reliance on open source methods and greater reliance on official sources. And we are very happy to put all of this treasure trove of information in the public for anybody to cite, to use, to build on, to improve. And we're very much looking forward to having our entire community scrutinize this data and to write to us if they have any comments or suggestions for improvement.
For everyone, particularly kind of in the global south, like if you could, kind of draw on your, kind of like the experience of immersing yourself in all of this work, and you could specifically advise, but I would think maybe policymakers and civil society in the global south around how to future-proof their specific kind of like national safety in their engagement with Chinese lenders. What are some of the kind of big picture advice you would give kind of global south stakeholders in how to have a healthy lending relationship with China?
Cobus, I think that it is very important for both civil society, the media in developing countries, as well as policymakers to use this data set and other data sets to develop a more sophisticated understanding of how BRI and Chinese development finance is playing out in other places. For example, if I am a debt manager or a Ministry of Energy official in Vietnam, and I am negotiating a 600 megawatt hydropower plant with China Exim Bank, well, they can easily dig into this data set to figure out what were the terms that were offered to Bangladesh or Pakistan or Zambia on a similar size projects by the same financier 1 or 2 years ago, and do their own analysis. I often go to developing countries and do workshops and give people the ability to dig into this data. Sometimes spreadsheets can be overwhelming. So we are trying our best now to improve the way in which we deliver this data. We have now built a customizable dashboard at china.aiddata.org that anybody can go and choose their favorite sector, favorite projects, favorite country, year, and we'll give you the details, and you can then download just that segment of the data rather than the entire spreadsheet. So I would urge everyone to take some time out of their busy schedules, look at your favorite topics, your favorite loans, and see where you stand vis-a-vis other creditors. And then you can also introspect and look at what terms were being offered by private alternatives, private sector alternatives, or Western banks, or your own funding sources to do the same sorts of projects. And also, I think that the fact that we have now released 250 or so loan agreements and escrow account agreements, it might also be worth their time to dig into those and try to find out what sorts of terms and conditions are being offered to their neighbors. And I think this is the least that they can do in terms of due diligence before entering into any kind of lending agreement for public welfare, whether it is with the Chinese or others. We are a platform that makes this information available, and we are on a mission to try to make this information more and more accessible to people in the global south. I'm looking for friends, partners, and allies who can help us deliver this mission. Very much looking forward to collaborating with others.
It is definitely worth the time. The report is The Belt and Road Reboot, Beijing's bid to de-risk its global infrastructure initiative, by an enormous team at AidData. This is a landmark report. It is a report that we'll be referencing for years to come. I presume you're going to be building on it in the years to come as more data becomes available, but it is really, truly an incredible accomplishment. So congratulations to you, Brad, Sam, the entire team at William and Mary and AidData for doing this great piece of research. We're going to put a link to it in the show notes. We've also done a summary on our website that Cobus did a wrap on it. So if you don't want to kind of do a deep dive, you can look at his summary. Ammar, thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through it. We're going to follow up with the AidData team we're going to do some nerdy deep dives on some of the verticals and to really get into it, because I think a lot of folks who listen to this show are going to be interested in that. And as you said, it's the least that people can do if they are one of those borrowing countries, is to find out how this all works. So Ammar, thank you so much for your time. And once again, congratulations.
Thank you very much, guys. Your appreciation means a lot to us, and this is what keeps us going. I'll convey this to the team as well. I'm sure they'd like to hear some good feedback. Thank you so much.
Cobus, it's not an exaggeration to say that this is a landmark report. I wasn't kidding when I said that. I mean, this thing is enormous. And I didn't really have a sense of where to start when I was reading it, but through the conversation with Ammar, it just gives me chills a little bit to see how profound this is and how it really challenges so many of the assumptions that many people make about the BRI and Chinese lending. This is going to be a study, again, that we're going to talk about for a very long time. And I think it also speaks to the amazing capacity that the United States has. And I will even go as far as to say that it is unrivaled in the world now in terms of knowledge production about China. When we see what Boston University and the Global Development Policy Center is doing, the work that Deborah Browdigam has done over the years, AidData and Brad Parks' team there, and then go to universities across the country from UC Berkeley to Stanford to Harvard, it's incredible what they're doing. It makes me excited. At the same time, I wish that there was better research being done in Asia, in Europe, on the scale of what AidData is doing. They deserve an enormous amount of credit for this.
Yeah, I completely agree. I particularly wish they were more, obviously, Global South kind of like research. Like, obviously, this scale of this is, is because of this scale and and resources of American universities. So, I don't expect a kind of Global South institution to do something on this scale, but it, I wish there were more kind of cross-cutting and comparative Global South research being done about the specifics of this kind of lending, in particular Global South countries. I completely agree. I think it's due also to the power of American universities, where they're not as kind of like pulled by the way that that the political wind is blowing in the US, the way that American press institutions are. So, obviously we're talking right after the very, very sad announcement that the China project is closing. And, we've worked with them, we've written for them. It's really a tragedy because they were putting very, very even-handed and cool work, into the press space. And they ended up like just that kind of space in trying to walk a kind of an even-handed, objective and nuanced line on China ended up being not a sustainable line to walk in the US kind of press environment. Compared to that, US universities are a lot more sheltered and a lot stronger, kind of simply because they just have other kind of sources of revenue. And so that work is coming out of US universities. It might increasingly very difficult to do that work in the US press. And I think, that is, I think, a sobering thing to kind of keep in mind in looking at this work.
Yeah, and there's this whole infrastructure of financing that also bolsters this research, which is also so important. But we talk a lot on this show about the importance of China literacy. And just going back to what Ammar said, in his recommendation is that if you are from a borrowing country, you should at least take the minimum effort and do the basic due diligence of looking up in this database the loan contracts. This is also an incredible resource for civil society activists across Africa. In Kenya, we saw that civil society activists took the government to court all the way to the Supreme Court, and they didn't have access to the loan contracts. In this case now, there are thousands of documents that could be helping civil society to put pressure on their own governments for revealing the details about these loan contracts. Because in Africa, one of the big problems is the lack of transparency from the host government. Too often, everybody puts the burden on the Chinese, but as we heard Ammar say, they are not revealing these details to their people. They're not bringing them to the legislatures. They're not bringing them for third-party audits. This is all being done in secret, okay? That should be considered unacceptable in African democracies. All countries it should be unacceptable, but certainly in democracies where presumably it's the right of the people to know what their government is spending. And I think this database can help to achieve that objective. And so on this question of what do African countries want, the United States now is in the game, the Chinese are in the game, I want to leave us with a sentiment from our good friend, Hannah Ryder, who is the CEO of Development Reimagined, and she was recently featured in a Bloomberg mini documentary, and she was prominently featured in this Bloomberg mini documentary about this new rush by the United States to do infrastructure in Africa. And so there is now increasingly going to be a modicum of choice for African countries in terms of who they work with and who they partner with on various infrastructure projects. Not necessarily competition, but certainly more choice. And she had some very good advice for everybody in terms of how to look at this issue and where we are today.
The biggest question for African countries is not about what US or China are getting out of Africa. The biggest question is, what are African countries getting out of their relationship with the US and China? And is that delivering development?
It's a good question, Cobus. It's a very good question.
It's a really good question. And, I'm really glad that Hannah raised it. And I think one of the big myths that I think is really important to address is I think there's this kind of like assumption, and this is particularly an assumption I think that's very strong in the US, or particularly strong in the Biden administration. I think that, like the Biden administration has couched a lot of its competition with China as one between autocracies and democracies. And there is an assumption, I think, in the US that if there is a democracy, that then is the kind of magic bullet, kind of to make sure that there is kind of good outcomes or better outcomes development-wise. The problem is that in many African countries, one frequently finds democracy weaponized against its own population. So we know that many democratic governments are particularly happy or more willing to work with China because of this short project implementation window that we see from Chinese contractors. So it's possible for democratic leaders, knowing that they have to fight an election coming up, it's very attractive to them to work with Chinese contractors because then they get to, because of the short implementation window, they get to cut a ribbon right before the election. So great. That's one way in which the will of the people is being respected. The problem is that we also find a lot of African policymakers that only have an eye on the next election. They're only interested in the next election, and they don't care what happens in the election after that or the election 15 years down the line. So they are very willing to sign a contract because that allows them something to announce with the election in mind. They don't care what happens 15 years down the line. They don't care about having to repay that loan. In this way, kind of democracy in countries with weak governance and weak enforcement is frequently used against the population itself by politicians that are only interested in winning the next election. And so for civil society, it then becomes really, really important to use tools like the ones that AidData provides to make sure that the projects aren't just ribbon-cutting ceremonies for politicians with only kind of the next 5 years in mind, to make sure that they are actually sustainable, like way down the line, and that these loans are actually repayable and they actually have some kind of actual developmental payoff. And for that, the AidData tools are crucial.
Well, let's leave the conversation there. Again, this is an important report. We'll put the links in the show notes so you can see everything. And also in the show notes, you'll see a link to our subscribe button. And it's even more sobering this week to talk about a subscription to the China Global South Project because, as Cobus mentioned, the China Project, a very similar site to our own, which avoided the polarization, avoided the extremes, really wanted to provide balanced, nuanced coverage of China in the world, went out of business. And the fact is that if people don't support this media that is more moderate, it will go away. There's just no two ways about it, as we saw with the China Project. So we depend on your support. And this is an appeal for you to subscribe and to support balanced quality coverage, especially from a Global South perspective, which does not exist out there. We are the only ones in the space doing this at the scale that we're doing. We've got a team of 10 people in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East who are doing this. Again, bringing daily coverage of China and the world in a balanced way such that we have a substantial subscriber readership in the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in the U.S. State Department. And there are very few places in this world today where the Chinese and Americans are reading from the same source. And I think that speaks to the fact that we are achieving that balance in coverage, but it can't be done without your support. We want to thank our supporters on Patreon and also our current subscribers, our institutional subscribers, but we need more. We're on the edge just like the China Project is. So go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. You could try it out free for 30 days. If you are a student or a teacher, you can email me at eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will give you links to a 50% discount. Every subscription helps, and it keeps us alive another day. But in this new era of artificial intelligence and misinformation and disinformation that is now washing over social media, if you are one of these people that thinks you can get good quality information for free forever, you're going to find that increasingly difficult to do. And we're seeing this in the Israel-Gaza war, where so much misinformation is coming out. It's hard to understand what's what. The other thing which we do is we pull the stories that are underreported. Our top story today was the fighting in Shan State in Myanmar and the death of Chinese nationals and the PLA deployment to the border in Myanmar. That is not something you're going to find in other sources. We are covering the South China Sea conflict, the India-China border conflict, and we cover Africa with more passion than anybody else in the China watching space. So that is worthy of your time and hopefully worthy of a subscription, or at least just to try us out. So when we keep our rates intentionally low in order to reach the largest number of people. So that's my appeal just on this week when the China Project has gone away, and they probably will not be the last to go away, and we are going to fight as hard and as long as we can to stay relevant and to stay solvent. But it doesn't happen without people's support. And that's not only for us, that's for all quality media. I just want to, I'll get off my soapbox right there. So let's leave the conversation there. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus van Staden in Berlin, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.